Today I'm going to talk to you about a site on the Brooklyn waterfront called the Brooklyn Navy Yard. As you know, I'm an architect working in New York, and I'm working on a number of different projects at this waterfront industrial site. I'm very nervous and quiet. I'd like to talk to you about the Brooklyn Navy Yard site and the way that it's been redeveloped, because it's an urban waterfront site, and I think there are some lessons to learn from the successful redevelopment of the site about the benefits that urban centers can provide to the redevelopment of similar sites, as well as illustrating some of the benefits that this type of site can provide to local communities that have been adversely affected by deindustrialization. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. economy has been characterized by a move toward deindustrialization, and this has put a lot of industrial heritage in threat. So in the past, this is a historic photo of the New York City waterfront, and as you can see, it was a heavily industrialized zone, and this was due in large part to the city's natural deep water port. The Port of New York is one of the largest natural harbors in the world, and it's made up of 770 miles of coastline. It connects the central United States to the coast via the Erie Canal, and by 1860, half of the trade coming out of the United States or going out of it passed through the Port of New York, so it was an extremely busy place. The waterfront infrastructure associated with the port and this trade remains a defining characteristic of the landscape today, but increasingly it's under threat from real estate development, rising property values, the obsolescence of the infrastructure itself, changing waterfront planning priorities, which now favor kind of parks and esplanades. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the types of buildings that you can see on the New York waterfront. In the 19th and 20th century, waterfront architecture was continuously evolving to keep up with innovations in building and shipping technology. So all of the initial buildings on the waterfront were wood, but as building technology evolved, the waterfront was one of the early testing grounds for new technologies. So during the Industrial Revolution, this included things like long-span trusses and lightweight steel frames. Later on, rolled structural steel shapes that allowed for large-scale production, and new truss designs that allowed for the erection of long-span, lightweight, prefabricated structures. These structures also had the obvious benefit of being fireproof, which was a tremendous advance in terms of the construction. It was also the site for a lot of early testing grounds for early experimental uses of concrete. This is a historic view of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, taken during the 1940s when it was in full swing as a shipbuilding facility. During World War II, there were over 60,000 people employed at the Navy Yard, and it operated 24 hours a day at the peak of wartime production. Today, the site is unique in that it remains a uniquely intact version of waterfront building industrial heritage. So most of the New York City waterfront now is parks and luxury condos, but this remains an industrial park. These are some of the buildings that you see on the site. The site is enormous. It's 300 acres, and there are buildings from the site was founded in 1801 and it closed in 1966. So you have 140 years of maritime industrial architecture, and you have all these buildings right next to each other for the most part. So there are 40 different buildings in there, 3 dry docks, and 4 active piers. And they include not just locations of industrial production, but also kind of support facilities like residential and office buildings that were a part of the manufacturing that took place on the site. This is another photograph of the Brooklyn Navy Yard today. As I said, while most of the waterfront, you can sort of see, is given over to parkland, bridges. This remains an industrial site. The park is currently experiencing the largest expansion it's seen since World War II, and it's blossomed into a local economic engine within the city of New York. Right now, there are over 7,000 people employed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and 330 different tenants. To understand kind of the success of the current situation, it's helpful to know a little bit more about the history of the site, particularly after it closed. As I mentioned, during World War II, the Brooklyn Navy Yard was one of the primary employers in Brooklyn, and after the Second World War ended, the site began to suffer from some of the same problems that affected other large urban waterfront industrial sites in New York City in the second half of the 20th century. So this included things like the decline of the maritime industry, the inefficiency of distributing goods through the city, and the rise of containerization in shipping. As I don't know how everyone's geography is, but Manhattan and Brooklyn are all essentially islands, and with the rise of containerization, it became extremely inefficient to bring goods into that location. It made more sense to bring it directly to New Jersey, also associated with the Port of New York, where it had a direct connection to inland railways. So this led to a loss of a number of jobs, and it also affected the location of manufacturing. So manufacturing became much more suburbanized. So the industries that had made New York City a manufacturing center located outside of the city to places where wages, taxes, real estate costs, all of that was lower, space was more available, and there was more direct access to transport. When the Yard closed in 1966, it was the largest closure of any military facility up to that point in U.S. history, and it was the largest source of urban manufacturing jobs at the time. The closure was a symbol of government disinvestment, the decline of large-scale manufacturing, and the obsolescence of the city's large industrial complexes. You can understand there was a lot of upset on the part of labor unions and workers when this took place, because all of these people lost their jobs. And under pressure from labor unions, the City of New York initiated a plan to operate the site as an industrial park. The goal was to create a sustainable and viable urban manufacturing center to provide jobs to communities that had been adversely affected by the Yard's closure. This is an image of the Yard today. What a success. It's occupied by a range of light manufacturing users across a variety of sectors, including woodworking, fabrication, technology, entertainment and media, printing, medical services, and also warehouse distribution. But the redevelopment of the Yard since 1966 has not been uniformly successful. In that period, in that 50-year period, the site was operated by two different organizations, two different nonprofit industrial developers. The first operator attempted to revitalize the site were largely unsuccessful. So in the 70s and 80s, the site was largely derelict. And in 1985, there was a low point where there were fewer than 1,000 people employed and less than 30 businesses on the site. These are some further examples of the building stock that's been reused. The first building is Building 128. You can see that it wasn't looking so great as little as 10 years ago, and it was recently reclad. They poured a new floor and put in some new HVAC systems, new windows too, and now it's marketed as the Green Manufacturing Center, so it accommodates a range of uses. The second building is Building 92. This is part of the residential stock, so this is the old Army commander's house, and one of the issues with the Brooklyn Navy Yard is that it's completely closed off to the public. There's no access. So in Building 92, they made a welcome center and museum to kind of introduce the public to what's going on in some of those spaces and make the history more accessible. So there's a bit more curation about the different things that happened in the yard, a kind of educational component. Building 77, the final building, is a project that I'm working on. It's 18 floors and 1 million square feet of trouble. As you can see in the historic photo, only the top 4 floors had windows, and those were offices, and all of the lower levels of the building were used as storage or for warehouse purposes. So as part of our work, we have punched new window openings in the lower 14 floors and demised the floors into smaller loft spaces so they can be used for smaller light industrial purposes. I think that in general, the revitalization of the Brooklyn Navy Yard is regarded as a success, and I think that the successful revitalization is due to several different factors. In the first place, the large site was in a major urban center, so it could take advantage of the diverse economic landscape of the city. The site management model was very important. There's a partnership between city government and the nonprofit industrial developer, which provided an important level of transparency and oversight to the operation of the site. And I think lastly, but perhaps most importantly, is the long time scale of the redevelopment. Since the organization managing it was allowed time to evolve and respond to different ideas, they were able to adapt to the changing economic landscape. Whereas in situations where government operators are tasked with obtaining the maximum market value in a really short time frame, frequently, they fail to realize all of the potential benefits of an adaptive reuse site. The City of New York has taken note of the successful revitalization of the site, and they're invested in the idea of creating and preserving manufacturing jobs and facilities. And when they saw how well the site was doing and the heightened occupancy in the facility, it led the city to invest in upgrading some of the yard's infrastructure to keep it viable as an industrial site. And some of the expense associated with these upgrades were some of the largest expenses associated with keeping the site viable. So they did things like retrofitting piers, sewers, underground water and electrical. And they've also, inspired by the successful redevelopment of the Navy Yard, they've created other formal industrial financing programs, and a number of other nonprofit industrial developers have surfaced in the city of New York. So there are other large sites like this on the waterfront, like the Brooklyn Army Terminal pictured here, which is essentially one building, but it faces many of the same challenges in terms of size. So that has been successfully adapted for similar purposes. And there's another developer in New York called the Greenpoint Manufacturing and Design Center that redevelops buildings in North Brooklyn on kind of a piece-by-piece basis. So they're single buildings that are much smaller in scale, but they're able to take advantage of the same financing opportunities. And then the lower picture is the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which, inspired by Brooklyn, was redeveloped in a similar way. So I hope you found this interesting. Thank you.